everyone. It's so great to see all of you back here. I hope you're enjoying your lunch, and I really hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. I have been blown away by the sessions that I've been in, and they're standing room only, and they're inspiring, and I'm just having a great time. So I hope you are as well. Before I introduce our lunch keynote speakers, I first want to draw your attention to the small cards on your table about democracy policy. And I'm going to advance the slides so you can see the QR code. As you all know, our lunchtime plenary will center around democracy policy today. What does it take to develop a framework for a successful modern democracy? This is obviously not a straightforward task. Democracy is a system of governance that reflects the collective will of the people under it. And there are many different ways to achieve that ideal. As we work to bolster democratic institutions, we must also re-examine foundational principles. What is democracy truly meant to achieve, and how can it best fulfill that mission? Earlier this week, GSPP sent out a link to Polis asking what is the kind of democracy that you would like to see in the United States? What are the underlying beliefs that should guide the design of our elections, the structure of our government, and the shape of public discourse? What policies do you think we should pursue to strengthen our democracy along these lines? If you've not had a chance to submit your responses, please go ahead and scan the QR code to do so. We will share some of the results at the end of lunch, as well as after the conference. And now for our lunch keynote panel. Earlier this year, GSPP launched its Democracy Policy Initiative, which aims to protect, promote, and help deliver on the promise of our multiracial democracy. The DPI serves as an intellectual and organizing hub for developing the leadership, strategies, networks, rigorous evidence, and actionable solutions necessary to ensure human flourishing. Made possible with generous support from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, the Levi Strauss Foundation, the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, and the Peter E. Haas Jr. Fund, the Democracy Policy Initiative is about doing the hard work of democracy, rooted in collaborative multi-sector partnerships, rigorous research, education, and policy innovation. For today's conversation, we have a few of the key experts who are leading this new initiative. First, we have our Dean, David Wilson. David became Dean of the Goldman School in the summer of 2021. He previously was the Senior Associate Dean for the Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware, and a full professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. Dean Wilson's research examines how individuals formulate their political preferences about policy issues and justice, and how social cognition shapes broader survey response behaviors. His research has examined voting and election policy, attitudes and perceptions about technology, beliefs about spanking children, and the effects of perceived discrimination on workplace commitments. He is co-author of the 2022 book, Racial Resentment in the Political Mind. Next, we have Angela Glover Blackwell. Angela is founder-in-residence at PolicyLink, the organization she started in 1999 to advance racial and economic equity for all. Under Angela's leadership, PolicyLink gained national prominence in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, and infrastructure. Angela is also the host of the Reimagining Democracy for a Good Life podcast and the Radical Imagination podcast. She is also professor of practice at the Goldman School, teaching a course called Race, Democracy, and Public Policy. And she's also our new Chief Vision Officer for the Democracy Policy Initiative. Next to Angela is Jake Grumbach. Jake is an associate professor at the Goldman School. He was previously associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton. Jake studies the political economy of the United States with interest in democratic institutions, labor, federalism, racial and economic inequality, and statistical methods. His book, Laboratories Against Democracy, investigates the causes and consequences of the nationalization of state politics. Now we have Amy Lerman. Amy is the Michelle Schwartz Chair and Professor of Public Policy and Political Science here at UC Berkeley, and Executive Director of the Possibility Lab. Her research is focused on issues of equity, public opinion, and political behavior, especially as they relate to public safety and social inequality in America. Amy previously served as a speechwriter and communications consultant for national nonprofits and members of the U.S. Congress, a community organizer in Latin America and Southeast Asia, and an adjunct faculty member of the Prison University Project at San Quentin State Prison. Last year, she was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And finally, we have our moderator, Ian Bassin. Ian is co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. He previously served as Associate White House Counsel, where in addition to counseling the President and senior White House staff on administrative and constitutional law, his responsibilities included ensuring that White House and executive branch officials complied with the laws, rules, and norms that protect the fundamentally democratic nature of our government. He's a recipient of a 2023 MacArthur Fellowship, the Skoll Award for Social Innovation, and has repeatedly been named among the 500 most influential people in Washington by Washingtonian magazine. So I don't think I need to say that we have a powerhouse panel here today for you all. So let's give them a round of applause before they even start. Thank you all so much. Please take it away, Ian.
All right. Thank you, everybody. So, they tell you you should live in interesting times. And in that case, if you are alive, I guess, congratulations. You're doing it. There are times in which nothing transpires for decades, and there are times in which decades transpire in an afternoon. And we are living in the latter of those. And in particular, we're living in the latter of those when it comes to what form of government is going to be the dominant form of government around the world. We are coming out of an era, the last quarter of the 20th century, in which liberal democracy was ascendant and was the dominant form of government around the world, and it was understood, famously, by political scientists to potentially represent the culmination of thousands of years of figuring out how to organize human civilization and political society, the assumption that we had reached perhaps the end of history. But alas, as we turned into the 21st century, that changed, and democracy began to go into retreat, and forms of authoritarianism were on the rise, globally and, yes, here in the United States. And so that brings us to today, 2024, a year in which more people will vote in elections on the planet Earth than at any previous year or point in human history, including in the most consequential election this country has seen since 1860 that is less than 2 months away. So it's into this moment, a question of whether democracy in some form or some other form of government will dominate the 21st century, that we're here today for the launch of the Goldman School's Democracy Policy Initiative. And so I want to start, Dean Wilson, with you by asking, what is it that we're trying to do here with DPI? What inspired it? Introduce to everybody here the concept of DPI and what it is going to be here at Goldman.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everyone, for being on the panel. Thank you, Annie, for introducing this. Thank you all for being here and being here at this particular panel. I have two hats. One, as a professor, I'm deeply interested in what the public thinks about the world around them and how they process information, use that information to inform their behaviors. I study judgments, emotions, sentiment, interactions, relationships. And so that is the essence of American politics, the masses engaging with one another to help govern their society. As a dean of a school of public policy, we're interested in the study of advancing plans that direct our society through government. Public policy is about action. It's about directing things in a certain space. And we don't just direct random things, we tend to direct problems. And as Ian mentioned, there are several problems that exist around democracy at the local, state, and federal level. Traditionally, democracy is a subject for political science. It's a subject for law. It's a subject for sociology. Not a bad thing. But the action component of democracy belongs to public policy. It belongs to schools of public affairs. If you open up any introduction to public policy textbook, you will see economic policy, health policy, education policy, defense policy. It'll go on, and you will get to the end of that book and not see a chapter on democracy policy. It doesn't exist. And yet, it is a critical part of how we must advance change in society. So we're going to have to build it. And the Goldman School is going to lead that building effort. And that building effort starts with an initiative. We have to initiate the activities to actually create something that doesn't exist, organize it for some outcome, perhaps human flourishing. Organize it by understanding how government works and learning from the greatest state in the United States, California, at the greatest public university in the world, with the #1 school of public policy in the world. When people look to change, they look to leaders. We are a leader, and the Democracy Policy Initiative is designed for us to take on a new course of action to help us change and protect, promote, and deliver on the promise of democracy.
Thanks, Dean Wilson. And I want to continue to sort of unpack and flesh out this idea of democracy policy, because you could see a world in which people connect so many different aspects of all the other policies that you listed that are in the public policy textbook to democracy, obviously. Our public education system matters enormously for our democracy. So talk a little bit about how you envision the contours of what is democracy policy, what's in, perhaps, what's out. How do you think about making those distinctions, and put some more meat on the bones of what it'll look like to really dig into democracy policy?
Thank you, because this is the benefit of being at a university, is that we get to help answer those questions in ways that they might not have been thought about before. So everything that we do, since every single thing, the air you breathe, the water, the quality of the water you drink, the ways in which your seats are designed, the existence of a public university, it's all public policy. And therefore, these policies designed to support public problems, these are the ways in which we provide quality to our democracy. So public policy is about really making sure that people can actually experience and participate in government in effective ways. They can experience and value civic life. When you think about voting in elections, for example, it's not social welfare policy, it's not economic policy, it's not criminal justice policy, even though they have elements of all of that. Voting in elections. We now have more policies than ever around identity. How do we deal with issues of gender, issues of race, without bucketing them always into one of those areas like economics and criminal justice? The role of identity in a democracy deserves some policy attention. The tools that we use to analyze policy traditionally focus on economic outcomes like efficiency and the like, but we're now being asked to be more and more equitable. It's a different kind of value. And how do we do that in government, knowing that it's hard to represent every single group, every single individual, every single time? So we're trying to build a system of understanding how democracy works and how to develop plans of action that support a well-functioning democracy, knowing that sometimes things are legal, but they may be undemocratic, right? And that those kind of contentious efforts require more interrogation. And right now we don't have a vehicle for that. And so our school can be the place where we develop tools to help us better understand how to protect, promote, and deliver on the promise of democracy, identifying the categories that matter, being able to say that, yeah, that might be health policy, but it has democratic value because it is assisting with human flourishing, for example. So this is something that we're going to work on and develop over the course of at least the initiatives start. But we do have some initial ideas, and this panel will help us get there.
We're gonna start right now.
Yep.
We're gonna start right now, because if you think about some of the other areas you mentioned, education policy, well, we generally know the goal is to educate the population. If you think about healthcare policy, we know the goal is to provide quality healthcare, advance innovation in affordable and efficient ways. When you think about democracy policy, we need to start thinking about what's the goal. And so, Angela, I want to bring you in here because you have talked about how we need to promote and deliver on the promise of democracy. And so I gather from saying that you have in mind some idea of what the goal is, what the shore is that democracy policy should be sailing towards. So tell us a little bit in your mind, what is the promise of democracy that we're trying to deliver on that democracy policy should steer us towards?
Thanks for that question. Loving the way this conversation is developing already, and so happy to see so many of you here to help us think hard about this. As you were saying, Ian, democracy is in trouble. And part of the reason it is in trouble here, and I'm not so can't speak to the rest of the world, is that we've been taking it for granted or not thinking about it at all. And when we think about it, we usually think about it in the context of it's time to vote. And it's time to make sure you're registered to vote. And the closer you get to the election, you start paying a little bit of attention to what's on the ballot. In California, we often have initiatives that cause you to really have to get deep into some issue to figure out what your position is. But that's sort of it. And when that's it, it's not very robust. It's not very important. It's not really a part of who we are. And so I think we have to ask in this moment where we can be pretty uniform in our notion that democracy is in trouble, and probably we ought to save it because we so associate it with the nation, but we need to ask democracy for what? Democracy for what? And that's democracy for what that really can get us excited and leaning in and seeing that we all have to stay engaged. When I think about democracy for what, it seems to me that the things that are there when you think about democracy's origins in terms of the Greeks, in terms of indigenous peoples here, the notion of how to be able to pull in the people whose lives are going to be impacted by decision-making, by governing, to make sure that it is governing in their interests, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And when you think about the founding, the framing of this nation, there really are some fabulous ideas about the what. But then in the implementation of it, those ideas, there was no carry through. So that we actually had the idea of a strong democracy that was built on genocide and stolen land, on human bondage and slave labor, on only people who were white and male and landowners, and in many instances, enslavers, able to vote and participate. Clearly, good ideas, moral failings. I say that those framers punched above their moral weight, and that we need to hold on to what it was that they were reaching for. And so when I think about why democracy now, it seems to be we need to get back to those notions of democracy for human flourishing. And you can't invest and govern for human flourishing if you don't know who the people are, if you don't know what they want, if you don't know what their challenges are, if you don't know what assets they have. And so being able to engage, which Amy talks a lot about, being able to have real agency is super important. And being able to actually do this, be able to stand on and own that sordid history that I was just describing, and bring it into sharp relief. Not just in the ugliness of it, but the magnificent moments of it. And they have existed as well. Bring all of that into sharp relief. And then stand there and allow your moral imagination to skip way ahead of our current reality. And think about how, with this population, in this time, with these assets, do we govern of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that democracy in service of human flourishing so that we can all have a good life, I think is what really grounds the quest that we're on now.
Well, I want to take advantage of the wisdom on this panel, not just on the question of what in terms of democracy policy, but also, and I want to stay with you, Angela, on the how, because you just articulated a vision there. And I would point out that when you launched PolicyLink, you also introduced a concept and a vision, a concept of racial equity that was relatively new at the time that you were introducing it, and then you built a organization, a campaign, and a movement about introducing it into American culture and thought to the degree that it is ubiquitous in a very positive way today. And so if we can take some of your lessons and experience for the Democracy Policy Initiative, not just on the what, but the how. Is there advice and lessons that you have from how you did that so successfully at PolicyLink that we should be taking into account here at DPI about how do we begin to socialize some of the ideas you just talked about what it is that we're trying to do in terms of where democracy is going and how we do it?
I thank you for that question. And I do think that part of what happened as we were building a movement around equity and racial equity in particular is that we were able to capture movements that already existed, but that were separate from each other. We didn't introduce something and then have to create it out of whole cloth. That the movement for equity required that we pay attention to how where you live in this nation is a proxy for opportunity. And there were lots of people working on housing, but they weren't thinking about it in the way that I just said it. That housing was actually education policy, because where you live is a proxy for opportunity. That housing was transportation policy, that housing was health policy, that housing actually determined whether or not you lived in a natural job network, which is how people get their first jobs. You know somebody who has one that said, come on, they're hiring. And so we were able to take that kind of analysis and apply it to education, to housing, to health and transportation, help everybody see how these things were interrelated, but that they would not really advance equity. Let me tell you how we define it: just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We couldn't get to equity if those domains did not work together, if they didn't understand their contribution, if they didn't have data that they could all pull from. And so we were able to start a movement for racial equity by leaning into movements that already existed and helping them to see, if they came together, had sharper analysis, sharper measurements, sharper goals, and a way to be able to work together and share, we could do something extraordinary, which is why equity is ubiquitous. It didn't require people to step away from what they were doing, but to lean into what they were doing with new vision, new imagination, and that's what I think we need to do around democracy.
I mean, I often think of a brilliant statement as one that once it's said, it's so obvious, how did you not think of it before? And the notion that democracy is something that is going to be bubbling up from people who are doing things that you need to go out there and harvest and lift up is so obvious, because democracy at its core is about the power and the ideas coming from the people. And so I want to bring Amy in here, because at the Possibility Lab, you've been looking at ways of, expanding engagement with different publics in civic participation, in democracy. So taking Angela's advice, we got to look what's out there. What are you seeing in terms of the bright spots out there that are the green shoots of public engagement in civic discourse and democracy that may be sources for us to draw on here at DPI?
I, first of all, always take Angela's advice. That is a good lesson for all of us. I think, the work that we've been doing at the Possibility Lab, and echoing some of what Angela mentioned, we're really thinking about what does democracy mean beyond elections. And elections are a very particular kind of democracy. They're a feature of representative democracy. And what we're thinking about between elections is how we really move from for the people to by the people. Right? Really thinking about what it is that citizens and residents can do between elections to inform what government does. And we often talk about this sort of part of democracy and civic engagement as an ethical piece of how we think about democracy. But we are also thinking about it at the lab as an instrumental part, because the expertise that people have about the problems that they encounter in their daily lives can help us as policymakers make better decisions. They have an extraordinary amount of knowledge about what's working and what isn't working, and how to fix it. And when we don't tap into that expertise, we miss this incredible opportunity to expand the scope of expertise, to take advantage of all of the different perspectives that might help us solve really deep social problems. So one of the things we've been doing at the lab is really thinking about civic engagement as a toolkit, that we can work with communities, and we being policymakers, being government agencies and departments who are doing the work on the ground, to think about how we can sort of share governance with communities that we serve in ways that allow us to share across different kinds of expertise. And so I think we have this really incredible opportunity right now to think more creatively. We have all of these digital tools. We have, deep roots in communities, and if we bring all of our innovation to democracy in the same way that we have started to think about innovation and technology, right? We can do the same thing in democracy. We can be really creative and thoughtful. We can reach out to communities who are thinking about these questions and ask for their assistance. And I think it has all kinds of downstream benefits around rebuilding trust and collaboration and the ability to solve problems through dialogue and through compromise and all of the things that it sometimes feels like, particularly lately, that we aren't very good at anymore.
And I want to pull together all the different pieces here, because the way I think this looks in a healthy system is we have vision laid out in terms of directions we might want to go in. We're listening. We're really engaging people. And then there's also a role for institutions like this to play to then sort of translate some of that and analyze that and do research on it in order to then develop all the things that we're hearing into policies that will advance that goal. So Jake, at the Democracy Policy Lab, you're taking on the piece of it, which is, okay, let's listen to some of this. Let's do some research on how some of these different ideas might work. Tell us a little bit about what are the crucial areas for research right now, and what are some of the needs that you feel like that are out there for researchers, especially for those in this room who are thinking about digging into that as students, as professionals. What's that landscape look like?
Absolutely. It's great to be on this team and to be like a nerd on part of this team and the sort of on the rigorous research. And so the
You
democracy
saw how I
policy-
did that to you there, right? I was like, we got the visionary, we got
Exactly.
someone out there
And you got
learning,
the nerd.
and then we're going to bring the nerd in. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm wearing glasses up here. So at the Democracy Policy Lab within the DPI, the Democracy Policy Lab is sort of the academic rigorous research unit where we bring together people within the Goldman community, faculty, graduate students, as well as across the UC Berkeley campus and outside. And here we're really following, so, you know, democracy, liberal democracy, democratic republic, small d, small r, however we want to put it, is based on two real principles. One is freedom from authoritarianism, and that's civil rights and liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, peaceful transfers of power between elites, and fair political competition, as well as political equality, the idea that voices are all heard, people have an ability to raise their voice, and that voices are sort of weighted equally in a one-person, one-vote style, whether that's in elections or between elections. So what we do really at the lab is we measure the health of democracy, and that takes measurement. How well are we doing on these metrics? How responsive is policy to mass public's wishes? How's it looking for peaceful transfers of power or potential coups? And we look at what sort of policy designs, organizational forms, institutions can really improve, protect, safeguard democracy. So here, that's sort of linked up in what everybody's said here, but I'll just, just give a couple examples of what we're doing. So we have such a great team of very small staff, as well as affiliated graduate students and scholars across the Goldman and beyond. So we have, affiliate scholar Dorothy Kronick, sort of one of the top scholars of free and fair elections in Latin America, who did the top election audit of the contested Venezuelan elections. We just finished with MPP research assistant Francesca Britton, the State Democracy Initiative collection, which measures the health. So in the US, democratic institutions are mostly administered at the state level, sometimes delegated to counties and municipal governments, measuring the quality of democracy over time. We have PhD student Rachel Funk-Fordham and a set of MPPs from my Quant 2, everybody's favorite class, Quant 2 in the MPP sequence, working on election reforms like automatic voter registration for accessible participation in elections, and showing how that makes public policy more in line with the wishes of American citizens. That's incredibly powerful set of research. And I will just say, though, as a researcher and nerd, there's a balance here. So I do think information and research really is crucial to see how we're doing and to move the ball in policy design, but really in conjunction with people who are on the ground, practitioners, organizers, and so forth. That sort of nexus is what's really crucial, and I think in the broader DPI is what's going on. But I'm sure we'll talk more about these threats, emerging green shoots in democracy, plenty more to discuss.
mean, because right now it sounds pretty good. We've got a vision for where we might want to go. We've got mechanisms and labs that are looking at sort of what's bubbling up and what's working. We got a research agenda that's trying to source all this out. DPI is going to house all this and accelerate it as an engine. That all sounds great. But I left out a part of Angela's quote when I asked her at the beginning, what does it mean to promote and deliver on the promise of democracy? Because the beginning of that quote from Angela is to protect, promote, and deliver on the promise of democracy. And there's a big protection piece that we need to be doing because we're in a moment where a large part of the motivation for doing all this is just how fragile we're seeing our democracy is. Our democracy has always been imperfect. Our democracy has been rife with deep tragedy. But for so much of at least this country's existence, we have been moving in the direction of perfecting it. And we seem to have hit a moment where directionally we have gone into reverse. And Amy, I think some of that, there's a lot of potential causes for it, but some of it people attribute to a growing cynicism, a loss of faith in our institutions, a loss of faith in the idea of democracy. Can you say a little bit about how did we get here? Where is that coming from? And what does that portend for us if it isn't sufficiently addressed?
I mean, it's a big question. There's no one explanation for how we got here, but for those of us who study trust in government, what we see is a really significant decline over the period of time that we have been measuring trust in government across all groups. And right, pre-Watergate, pre-Vietnam, pre-civil rights, there were higher levels of trust at all levels of government, state, federal, and local, and they've declined across the board. So there are a couple of explanations. One is all of the events I just mentioned, which were really difficult periods of time for different reasons. As people felt like government wasn't delivering on promise, that government became more complicated, they started to see all of the ways in which government couldn't be trusted. So some of it is that, but then there's also been a sort of an increase in rhetoric, actually from both sides of the aisle, about how we need to solve the problem of government, right? Government is the problem. And we think of this as conservative rhetoric, but in fact, liberals often use different language, but are equally likely to complain about government, right? That it's not delivering. And there is truth to that, but it also has the effect of undermining trust. And so we're in this sort of strange cycle where we assume that what is delivered by government is just not going to be as good as what is delivered by the private market. And so there is this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that happens when we believe that government can't deliver high-quality things. Those who have the resources and the opportunity will opt out of the government thing, thereby leaving fewer resources for government to solve problems, and then the quality of what government can deliver is diminished. So when we think about rebuilding trust, we really need to start from the bottom up. We need to think about trust as really recognizing that we are government, right? And not just the people in this room who work for government, but everybody, right? Government is people working together to solve collective problems that can't be solved by the market alone. And if we think about government not as something that delivers to us, but that's something we are part of and that we have a role in and a responsibility for, then we start to think about government in a really different way. And I think that gives us an opportunity to re-engage people in a really meaningful way.
Angela, do you want to jump in there?
I do. I agree with everything that was just said. And I don't think you can answer the question that you asked, how did we get here, without bringing in race and the racial angst of the nation and the impact of the changing demographics with the white population not being dominant the way that it has been for most of the time of the nation. I think that into the environment that Amy just described, you put two things. One is the way the economy has changed. And the fact that people have not in this nation dealt with the seriousness of the racial divide. And so as government had to focus more on poverty And poverty became more associated, true or not, became more associated with people who were black and brown. A stinginess set in that was reinforced by the rhetoric that served the way the economy was growing to benefit a few very well. That when I said that we need to be just as cognizant of the sordid nature of the history, we need to also be cognizant of the magnificent moments. And one of the magnificent moments that was also sordid was the building of the white middle class. Sordid because the mechanisms that were available in terms of access to education, access to mortgage, investment in the infrastructure that built the suburbs, the way that black people and brown people were kept out of that was sordid, but it was pretty magnificent, the way that government functioned for white human flourishing. It really did. And people were into that and appreciating that. And it helped to build a consumer base that helped the economy to be able to grow. The economy grows in different ways now. And people are not willing to make that same investment in the future. And that's why on the other side of what I think is a pretty bleak picture that I just painted, there's a very hopeful one. Because the fate of the nation is dependent on the very people who have been left and kept behind. The very people who have been left behind and kept behind will determine the future. And so if the people could begin to really participate in the way that Amy talks about, if those who see this future could participate and begin to vote for the nation's future, not their future, we have an opportunity for another remarkable breakthrough, magnificent moment for democracy.
And I'm glad you brought that up because it allows us an opportunity to point out something that I feel like doesn't get enough attention, which is that in the history of the world, there has never been a sustained, truly inclusive, multiracial democracy anywhere on the planet Earth. The great thing about the United States is we set an aspirational goal to achieve that, but we really never have. We got there as close as possible after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and that period of sustainment lasted roughly about 35 to 40 years until the crisis that we're in today, and I think that's no accident. You look around the world at countries that bring together lots of different people from lots of different races and ethnicities and religions, and most of them are beset by strife. They look like Lebanon. And we're trying to do something incredibly difficult here in the United States. And I think the positive way of looking at it is we're so close to potentially being able to get there. But perhaps being that close is also one of the dangers. In his book, Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about how the most dangerous thing during Reconstruction to those in the South was not bad black governance, it was good black governance, right? Because if during Reconstruction you elected black legislators in South Carolina and they failed, it would prove the white supremacist ideology of the South. But if they were not corrupt, if they were perfectly capable of governing, if they governed not just like the white legislators who'd come before, but actually even better, which they did because the white legislators were part of the corrupt old boys network, well, nothing could be more threatening to the antebellum white supremacist ideology of the South. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has a wonderful introduction to his book, We Were 8 Years in Power, where he cites that, and he says, whether you agreed or disagreed with Barack Obama's policies or his politics, he was every bit as normal a president as Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. And that was the moment that either we were going to enter that period or perhaps be pushed back. And I think we're in a moment where, because of that, we've been pushed back. And so the challenge now in terms of going forward, and Amy, I want to come back to here, is we have people for a whole variety of reasons, some that Angela alluded to, some that you alluded to, who are losing trust in the system or rejecting the system because of what it's doing. And you kind of hinted at this in your last answer, Amy, which is we need to sort of re-engage people, we need to rebuild trust, but that's particularly challenging with the people we most need to engage because they're the ones who are backing out and opting out. So talk a little bit about what are some methods by which we can try to re-engage people and bring people to the table or back to the table who are not at it or who may be backing away.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is so exciting is there are all these opportunities to really think about how we can bring people to the table. And part of it is recognizing their expertise. So not coming to them with a plan or a sort of sort of predetermined outcome, but really taking seriously that we're asking for their time and energy, and that we're going to be responsive to what they need and what they want and what they're telling us. So I think there is a whole set of tools that we can use at the local level and increasingly at the state level, where we can scale up some of the really successful practices at the local level through technology. And I am not a there is an app to solve every problem, but I do think, right, the fact that we are getting used to being on Zoom, we're getting used to communicating in different ways. There is an upside to the world that we live in, where we are technologically attached and where we're reducing the digital gap, and where we can reach out to young people and meet them where they are, or to communities and meet them where they are. And so we're thinking about all of the different ways that we can learn as we go. I think this is a research problem. We don't have all of the answers, and I think it's why we need a democracy policy initiative. We have so much to learn about how we rebuild democracy, not rebuild, but build a new framework for thinking about civic engagement that does live up to the promise of what we imagine to be the American experiment. So one of the things that we asked you all is to participate in this exercise called Polis, which is an open source software that can be used to think about how a group of people comes together to make decisions and to map consensus and conflict across a whole bunch of different kinds of issues within a policy space. It's been used most famously in Taiwan. So Taiwan launched an effort to engage with everyday people to try and figure out how to regulate Uber and Lyft. Right, a really specific policy problem that had lots of different kinds of stakeholders. And what they did was they built out a participatory framework, and they used this platform. It's also been used in all kinds of contexts in the US. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please do take advantage of Polis to let us sort of use you all as subjects to think through together what democracy policy can be. We have some preliminary results, but over the next week, we will leave the platform open, and we'll ask you all to engage with it, offer your statements for what democracy policy can and should be, and we will share out the results with you all. And we will take those results as starting points for thinking about the agenda that a democracy policy initiative can bring to life.
And you'll let us know when we've got results if we want to share them with anybody, so just get excited. So Jake, I want to come back to you here because we just started, Angela started bringing us to conversations about some of the drivers here. Amy's alluded to some of the drivers. They're drivers of fear of social status loss that may be leading to some of this crisis among populations that had grown used to having sort of heterodox control over our society and now are rightfully being forced to share that with a diversifying public. There are ideological polarization challenges that are driving us. There are challenges of the acceleration of changes in media and what the sort of pressures climate is bringing to bear on the situation. All of these pressures leading to our democracy crisis. Could you help us kind of walk through a bit of a taxonomy for us of how in academia people are trying to sort of categorize and understand all the different threats we're facing and how we might think about all of them leading us to this moment?
That's right. Oh, there's so many levels you can do, like the funnel of sort of specificity to generality of the crises we face. So one is just a threat of non-peaceful transfers of power at the national level that we saw, come very close to in early 2021. And that is a real actual threat that requires a lot of thinking around it. There's been a lot of movement around this from sort of scholars, theorists of democracy, and people in power as well. And some movements, I would say, to safeguard the national transfers of power and free and fair elections nationally. But then there's this second, longer-term sort of strain on democracy. Again, I said elections are administered at the lower level of government, the state level. Legislative districts are drawn at the state level. They can be drawn in a balanced and fair way where everybody has a pretty equal voice in setting a legislative majority, or in a pretty unfair way that dilutes some people's votes and enhances other people's votes. And at the state level, what we've seen, and in a lot of my research and my book, Laboratories Against Democracy, one of the New Yorker's 100 best books of 2023. Thanks. What we, research this quantitatively is that in some states, right now, like California, it's easier to vote than at any time in US history. Like, it's a real triumph. California and other states, California was not, I would say leaders, unfortunately, like, you know, Washington, Oregon, Colorado were a little ahead of California, but in these measures, California sort of, you know, since 2020, really catching up with the implementation of same-day automatic voter registration and so forth, universal all-mail ballots with backup provisional ballots for people who move and so forth. But in other states, we've seen some Democratic backsliding in terms of the fairness of legislative districting and in terms of how difficult it is to vote, where it's now in some states about as difficult as it was to vote as in the 80s. Not all the way back to pre-Jim Crow, of course, where there's full disenfranchisement of massive black populations in the South, but real strains on younger voters, voters who are lower income, and voters who are kept out, for example, in urban areas with long lines for in-person voting and so forth. So this actually is a huge deal where in a federal system like the US, multi-level governance, it's not enough to say the average is going, some states doing better, some states doing worse, the average just chugging along, right? In a federal system, states administer elections from local dog catcher up to president. So what happens in the Georgia Secretary of State's office, in North Carolina, in Midwestern swing states, reverberates for national governments in powerful ways. And at the state level, something as simple like, you know, I used to, you know, growing up, a lot of us care about a real material policy issue. I really cared about healthcare. I saw people in my neighborhood and around the city be uninsured, mispreventable sort of illnesses that would then get worse over time, and it ended up costing the public health system even more than it would have been to just help them with their diabetes early on. I said, oh, if the people in power just realized, you know, universal health care would be more efficient, like, and then no, you realize actually supermajorities of Americans already want this. It's a problem of getting those voices into institutions, aggregating those preferences into actually changing something and beating powerful entrenched stakeholders. So democracy became the key issue there. And there we do see that something like gerrymandering in the states, a number of states have banned abortion against the supermajorities of their constituent preferences because districts are so gerrymandered that an anti-abortion minority of voters can really set the majority of the state legislature. So this isn't about my beliefs about reproductive rights or anything. This is about saying, wow, 60% of the people in the state want legal abortion. Why is it illegal now? It's because of democratic institutions. So we're working on this on both tracks, both reforming the Electoral Count Act, thinking about people transfers of power at the behavioral media level in this technological moment. The idea of that if mail ballots in some states, they're not even allowed to start counting till after election day hits. California, you can start counting them before. This means there's going to be all these sort of information, misinformation, sort of panic moments if elections are not called on that Tuesday night, as are traditionally the case. So behaviorally, technologically, thinking about how we really create a sense of social solidarity around support for our people doing the Lord's work, election administrators in counties and states, to count the votes freely and fairly. And then the second track at the state and local level especially, protecting and expanding democracy where we can and preventing the sort of withering of democratic institutions that's really starting to disrupt the relationship between people and what actually ends up happening in their cities and states.
So some of you may have noticed the irony that I'm running this democracy panel like an authoritarian. So I'm gonna take the advice of the panel because you've got to source all of the ideas from the population, from the Democratic polis. So I want to warn everybody. Jake, I have one more question for you, but then I'm sure there are things that we're missing. If we're putting on the table potential challenges and opportunities for DPI to look at, I want to ask the panelists, what are the things that we're missing that you really feel like we should at DPI be focusing on? And I'm going to open it up for that in a minute. But Jake, let me just go back to you while people think on that. What is so you listed a whole bunch of threats out there, things of concern. What's the dark horse? What's the thing that is keeping you up at night as a challenge to our democracy that perhaps isn't in the center of people's radar, that perhaps should be closer to the center of people's radar?
Yeah, I guess here I would say it's just a tweak on what has been said about sort of demographic threat, for example. But I think an underemphasized point of conflict over democratic institutions is just rising Gen Z and millennials, which overlaps with a lot of the concerns. Gen Z is the most likely to be children of immigrants of any generation in a century, right? Since the immigration waves of the early 20th century. They are different on all sorts of opinions, even within, particular political parties. You can see huge age differences in opinion over foreign policy, environmental policy, gender and sexuality. And again, I believe in political equality. Like, this is not about my policy views. This is about how to have everybody's voice heard equally. And there are huge barriers to young people participating in politics. So some new research out of the lab and myself, we did all this sort of statistical record linkage between campaign finance data and voting data. And we find that voting's really skewed. So in 2022, about 27% of Gen Z voted in the midterm. That sounds terrible, but that's actually the second best. Besides the 2018 midterm, that's the highest turnout young people midterm in a half century. The bar is that low, but good job, kids. You don't like your music, but you guys are fighting really hard. But I do think generational conflict is huge. There's conflict over voting on college campuses, whether students who are more likely to move around residential addresses have to re-register, or if they're automatically re-registered. These are huge deal policies, and a huge amount of the demographic threat is translated through trying to disenfranchise young people in the US because they tend to be more likely. It captures all of these forms of demographic threat. I think that's really crucial. And when we link this campaign finance and voter data, we found, for example, that the median dollar in American politics, money in politics in the US, more important than in other countries. We've got great researchers at the lab working on campaign finance. Money in politics really matters in the US, and you need money to spend money in politics, and the median dollar comes from a 66-year-old. So half of all money in politics is from people 66 and older. Gen Z, young people do not even show up in campaign finance. So beyond, if you think oh, it's bad that it's 3-to-1 voting between somebody age 70 and somebody age 25, it's a 3-to-1 voting gap, 9-to-1 voting gap in primary elections, which are in the polarized era increasingly important more than general elections, even more in state and local elections, which control democratic institutions. But then at the campaign finance level, it's 300-to-1, old to young, and that means that policy and politicians are going to respond to those voices much more than young voices. So this is about policy change. What sort of campaign finance policy can give everybody a more equal voice? So it's, again, not about my preferences, but that we can aggregate up everybody's voice. And I'm so loving what Ian started with, this, the promise of American democracy, true, large, diverse country, and that we can have a system that aggregates all these distinct preferences in a way that is fair to all. That is, I think, the promise of human civilization more broadly. So it's really exciting to, think we could be on the cusp of moving closer to that goal.
Okay, so what are we missing?
So I would say the generational
generational
politics is within parties too. You see this within institutions that have stakeholders of different ages. You're increasingly seeing this conflict, and I would just say, for all, I'm an elder millennial, so I'm stuck in between these groups a little bit. I would just say we should really try to treat young people's voices as equal value within the political system.
Dean Wilson, when you think about DPI, are there things that we haven't addressed yet that you feel like are really important ingredients in this mix?
I don't know. And my role as dean is always to kind of listen and then think about how to resource and support what others are offering. And I want to just make a few things clear that I personally believe that public policy is the practice of democracy because it involves bringing together people, problems, government, systems, and practices. And the only way to change those is through public policy, not just legislation, but really good plans for action. We should all be clear, there's only one academic unit or field that's ever been created specifically for the purpose of improving and understanding better government, and that's public policy. The schools were created after the expansion of government to make sure that we didn't get it wrong. And Hillary talked about that earlier this morning, trying to solve the tough problems around housing and poverty and opportunity and ensuring that we could be a country that actually had an American dream. And when you think about democracy, it's so many things. And we just rail kind of about how it means different things. When you think about the economy, it's the same thing. 50 different ideas about the economy, 50 different ideas about democracy. But economy and economic issues are solved by policy. Democracy is politics. We kind of just leave it to these amorphous one-offs. And the role of the initiative is to take all of this information and do the hard work of gathering it so that we can identify the right solutions, understanding government, understanding the people, and the gap that exists between them. And the only thing that you can do, you can't just have a bunch of efforts that exist at random. The only thing you can do is organize those to chart the right directions and courses of action that are supported by both government and the people. There are no policy schools that say, this is what we're going to build and this is what we're going to do. So the one thing that I think we're missing is a leader. And that's why I think this is so important now that California, Berkeley, and the Goldman School are in the position to actually lead on this. And you can hear it from the expertise. I know many people in this room care about the issue. We just have to provide the platform to make sure that we can start taking action and be a real resource.
So I have two things that relate to that and answer your question about what we haven't emphasized enough. And the one that relates directly to what David just said is the readiness and capacity of people in government to deliver on the promise of a democracy in service of human flourishing. And it is important to be able to call that out and invest in it, because we haven't asked people in government to do that, not at the level that it has to happen now. Because when we talk about the shifting demographics and we talk about the people who are being disproportionately left and kept behind, and it was David who got me to say left and kept, because I came to him and said, we need to stop talking about people who are being left behind, because it sounds like it's inadvertent and we're coming back for you. And the truth of the matter is people have been systematically kept behind through policies and decisions and practices that were intended to leave them behind. And he reminded me, though, that while that is true, there are also people who have just been left behind by an economy that didn't have a way to be able to keep up. So I say left and kept behind. As people who've been left and kept behind become the majority, begin to really demand that governing for human flourishing focuses on them, people who are running government need to have some new tools of being able to measure how they're making progress after having first really had a way to do what Amy's talking about, bring the people in to be able to set the goal and define the issues. We worry a lot now about what we're going to do with the loss of affirmative action, but the truth of the matter is that what we were doing through affirmative action, we need to be doing with all of government. We need to be doing it with all of government to make sure that we are investing in the people who are going to be the future. And for that to happen, we're going to have a different kind of training, a different way of asking those questions, a different urgency, a different standard for whether or not you're being successful. How are you doing along this road to human flourishing? The second thing that we haven't focused on enough, that when Amy talked about civic engagement, and I actually have done a lot of the work that she's talked about and have approached it in just the way that she said, and what it leaves out is the messiness of real participatory democracy, which doesn't happen because you have a meeting and you bring people in and you support them to be able to give their opinions. It happens because people have had enough and they're not going to take it anymore. And they begin to organize in their own communities. And if I may just talk about the podcast at this point, I have a podcast called Reimagining Democracy for a Good Life, and it focuses on Los Angeles. And the two pivotal points in Los Angeles, the uprising in Watts in 1962 and the rebellion in Los Angeles in 65, I think, in 92. particularly the rebellion in '92, caused people who had been organizing in California, particularly in Los Angeles, to realize that they're organizing within the Black community, the Chicano movement that had been operating in Los Angeles, organizing that had been happening in some Asian communities, that people realized in '92 that they had been caught completely unprepared. Because while they were doing this organizing, something had happened that set the whole city on fire. And they stepped back and realized they needed to be more conscious in their multiracial organizing. And the work of really doing that multiracial organizing was really hard, and people really rolled up their sleeves, and the podcast talks about that work and the generosity of those leaders. But then the realization that that organizing across race and difference really needed to be focused on power, because you can't make the kind of change you want if you're not focused on power. And focusing on power brings a lot of push and pull and tension, and they had to go through all of that. And they recognized that they really wanted to focus on power, they had to join with labor. And fortunately, in Los Angeles, the new labor movement, and I do think LA is the center of the new labor movement, it has people who are very much new to the country. It has people who have been marginalized within the country. It has people in developing areas of the economy, and has them with one foot in trying to figure out how to make their jobs work, but the other foot solidly in the misery and the aspirations of community. And so that joining together of labor and community to use that power to be able to demand change. And what did they demand change on? The thing that is really killing Los Angeles and so many cities is the unhoused. That was the thing that they had focused on, and then they elect Karen Bass, who makes that her #1 issue. Now, people will say with the Olympics coming, of course they had to focus on it, but what they had been doing all along is making sure that when the expediency of economic opportunity came along, they had to focus on community benefits. That had been what they were building power about before. So I have a 6-part podcast that tells that story, and the last one is hope is a discipline. And I think it's so important to say that. It's not just wishing things are going to be different, but it's doing the work of understanding the history, gathering the data, lifting up what works, finding comrades, building coalitions, and then asking, what do I need to do to be able to achieve this goal?
Angela, I'm so glad you brought us there, because I think we started with 3 of the legs of the DPI table. We started with a vision of where we were going, the leg about engagement, really, and listening to people, meeting people where they are, the leg about research and analysis and the development of policy, and the leg that was missing was culture. You talk about getting people ready to be in government, understanding what people are supposed to, how people are supposed to orient as citizens to their communities and to democracy. That's culture. That's what de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart. And I will just say from my experience in government at multiple levels, I served with so many wonderful public servants, and the vast majority of public servants serving us are doing an incredible job. But you could see where there were gaps in culture. You could see where people who perhaps came up through a political campaign developed a culture of oppositional, us versus them, got to beat them by any means necessary. When you get into government, that's not your job. Your job is to serve everyone. And there are gaps, both in the governing level and at the citizen level, in how to reinstill that small d democratic culture. And so I want to do a little bit of a democratic culture test before, David, I'm going to come back to you for the last word. And I'm going to have to beg Amy's forgiveness here, because I know Amy said that she doesn't always think there's an app for that, but she does have an app for gathering public opinion, and I am going to embarrass that idea by using the most analog version of it, which is the hand. So I want to do a show of hands here. So if I could promise you right now that I could give you a president of this country who would solve every problem that you're worried about, end racism, solve climate change, end gun violence, make sure everybody had all the opportunity they wanted, but there wouldn't be any more Congress, there wouldn't be any more courts, there wouldn't be any more elections. How many of you would take that deal? It's okay. It's very important that this be scientific, so don't worry about the public scoring, but raise your hand if you would take that deal. So I think, one, I want to call out the brave people who raised their hand, because I think there's a real honesty in the temptation of that. And I think there are some very difficult arguments out there over some of these questions. It has been a temptation that has been offered to people throughout history. My own view is it tends not to work out well in the long run, but it's a temptation that's being offered around the world today. And I was curious whether we were going to be in a place of challenge or opportunity in response to that, because Jake, you brought in the really important point about generations. And one of the things you see in the data is that younger generations of Americans are much more willing to raise their hand in answer to that question. If you ask Americans to what extent they believe it is essential to live in a democracy, older Americans overwhelmingly think it is. Younger Americans, for very understandable reasons, are agnostic about it. And I think one of the challenges and I think opportunities from that show of hands in the room, Dean Wilson, is that you have a population here who seems committed to this idea of democracy. So I want to give you the last word. It's the end of your deanship. It's been remarkably successful. I've looked into the crystal ball. It's been remarkably successful. And you're looking back on it, on why it was so successful and why DPI was so successful and what has made you so proud of it. And what is it that you're seeing that leads you in that moment to walk away with pride of a job well done and what DPI has done? Looking back, what is that? And let's leave us with that vision.
Yeah, I mean, I would like Goldman to be the place that everyone comes to understand what they need to do, the action they need to take to improve their democracy at the local level, state level, federal level, international level. I would want to see that we all believe in a toolkit that brings community and the public together with government, and that we have those tools, that we all don't mind a little bit of public opinion data as we're doing our analysis, because it's good stuff. And it helps us to understand the psychology of those who are participating in this ecosystem that we call a democracy that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people at different moments. That's one point. Just to be clear, democracy is not a static thing. In our minds, it is, like a great economy, a great democracy is static. If it's not race, it's going to be something else. If it's not war, it's going to be something else. And that's what democracy gives us an opportunity to deal with. It gives us a system for trying to ensure that domestic tranquility actually exists. And so when the preamble starts with "we the people" in order to form a more perfect union, the first thing they mention is established justice. And when you have injustice, you stop believing in the possibility of democracy. And so our work, our policy work, is about trying to continuously sustain and protect that idea that justice is critical to democracy and not a random thing that we should just feel. It has to have direction. It has to have protective rules and guidelines and common understanding. And so we could believe in civic learning as a requirement for good democracy, and we could believe that a university has a role to play in ensuring democracy sticks around.
Please join me in thanking our panel today.
Wow, thank you, Ian, Amy, Jake, Angela, and Dean Wilson for that lively conversation, for keeping our hope alive that we are doing the right work. That
Go Bears!
Go Bears! Thank you so much. That was very inspiring, and we're here to do the hard work of democracy, so we appreciate you leading us on that path. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here for lunch. I'm next going to hand the mic over to Nida Osai, who is our vice chair of the Alumni Association, the GSPP's Alumni Association board. And she's going to tell us about the networking session that's going to take place right here in this room from 2 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. And before I step off the stage, I just want to note that there will be a sweet treat just outside of here in the lobby from about 3:45 to 4:30, just to keep you going. And we want to make sure that you enjoy the rest of the afternoon sessions. And for those of you who are joining us for the Alumni Awards Banquet, we'll be right back here, and we'll see you back here at 5:30 p.m. So right now, it's my honor to introduce Nida Osai, our Vice Chair of the GSPP Alumni Board. Thank you, Nida.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Annie. I hope you're all feeling as energized and inspired by today's sessions as I am. It's truly an honor to be here with such talented and passionate group of change makers. My name is Nida Osai. I'm a proud GSPP alum, class of 22. Woo, okay. I'm also privileged to serve on the Goldman School's Alumni Association Board of Directors, which is a group of 15 dedicated and passionate volunteers that were elected by Goldman's diverse alumni community. Our role is simple, yet deeply impactful. We're ambassadors, advocates, and partners. We work closely with the school to enhance and support the alumni experience while also advancing Goldman's broader mission of public service and leadership. As a board, we meet quarterly and remain active throughout the year, spearheading various initiatives that foster meaningful connections, whether it's organizing events to strengthen alumni and student engagement, supporting recruitment to attract top-tier diverse talent to GSPP, or building a strong network to fuel the career advancement of our students and alumni alike. We are deeply committed to elevating our community. If you're a member of the Alumni Board, please stand so we can take a moment to recognize your invaluable contributions. Thank you. You'll find information at each table on how you can connect with us. And we would love to hear from you. We are eager to learn about some of the ideas that you might have, whether it's what you want to see more of from the Alumni Board, ways that you'd like to get involved, or how we can continue to build an alumni network that supports and inspires you. So please take a moment, reach out to us after the event. Now it's time to transition to the next exciting part of this afternoon, the alumni networking session. I am actually going to pass it on to my colleague, Kareli Ordaz, who's going to introduce the policy topics and our discussion facilitators. Thank you all so much again. Let's keep building this incredible community together.
Hola, hola, how we doing? Y'all still here? Can I get a whoop whoop? Louder, can I get a whoop whoop? Yes, thank you. I love the energy. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kareli Ordaz Salto. My pronouns are she, her, and I also have the incredible honor of serving on the GSPP Alumni Board. I am a public sector leader with over 12 years of experience spanning government, community anchor institutions, and recently philanthropy through the San Francisco Foundation. The next 30 minutes are going to be an exciting opportunity to network with our colleagues and our peers, to engage around a policy discussion that you may be an expert in or that you may have never heard about. And either is fine. The goal is to connect and engage and build connection. So in the next, I'm going to go ahead and read the tables that we have, and I'm going to introduce the facilitators for you to identify where you want to go and how you want to engage. So table one, does anybody see table one? I don't see it from here. Table one back there, it's focused on housing policy. And our incredible facilitator for the housing policy table is Anna A.J. Johnson, who is our incredible chair of the GSPP board. Yes. Is AJ here? AJ, can we see you? There we go, AJ over there, and they're making their way to their table. AJ is the policy director at California Competes, where they lead efforts on housing-related policies, post-secondary workforce alignment, and support for student parents. Previously, AJ served as Associate Director of Housing and Health at John Burton Advocates for Youth, advancing housing policies for foster and homeless youth. They also worked at the National Center for Youth Law and spent 6 years as an educator in Oakland and Philadelphia. Please join AJ to discuss housing policy. Table 2, where's table 2? Over here, awesome. That will be facilitated by yours truly. And the focus will be police civilian oversight. A few years ago, I had the honor of serving on the Oakland Police Commission as vice chair, where we led a lot of efforts to increase accountability in the Oakland Police Department. And I would love to talk to you more about that. So please join me, table 2, to discuss police civilian oversight. Table 3, where is table 3? Over there. Our incredible facilitator for table 3 is Mr. Abel Guillen. Can we give him a round of applause, please? Yes. Abel is a dear friend and former Oakland City Council member with a focus on education policy. As a Peralta Community College District trustee, he championed affordable higher education, student outcomes, and equity. Now he serves as our Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of California, where he oversees the entire state's education budget. So please join Abel to discuss education policy. Table 4, where is table 4? Back there, awesome. Table 4 will focus on state health policy, facilitated by Cody. Cody, are you here? Yes, let's give Cody a round of applause, please. Cody is North Carolina's Secretary of Health and Human Services, overseeing $38 billion budget, that's with a B, and 18,000 staff. Under his leadership, the state expanded Medicaid, enrolled over 500,000 people in 7 months, secured $1 billion for behavioral health reforms. He also helped relieve $4 billion in medical debt for 2 million residents. He holds a public policy degree from UC Berkeley. Table 5, where is table 5? Yes, awesome. Table 5 is focused on tech policy. Hank, are you here? Yes, let's give Hank a round of applause. Hank currently serves as the head of U.S. state and local policy for Anthropic PBC, a frontier model LLM developer and safety lab. He has previously held similar roles for Snap and Dropbox, spent more than a decade working for the state assembly in various roles, and is a 3-time graduate of UC Berkeley. Go Bears times 3, yes. Table 6, yes. Table 6 is focused on textile and packaging policy. Please give a hand to our facilitator, Jennifer Liu. Also a dear colleague of the GSPP Alumni Board. Jennifer is a MDP 2020 alumni who leads waste and circularity efforts at GAP's global sustainability team. Given increased legislative action in the space, she spends most of her time building GAP's compliance strategy for state and provincial packaging extended producer responsibility, or EPR, policies. Please join her to talk about this incredibly exciting topic. Table 7, where is table 7? All right. Table 7 will focus on climate and energy and will be facilitated by our dear Nida, our vice chair, who you've heard from. Nida is our director of strategy and operations at AAA, leading AI research and innovation for responsible technology use in regulated sectors. With over a decade of experience in global tech policy, entrepreneurship, and business development, her work bridges policy, technology, and business. Thank you, Nida. Table 8, where's table 8? Thank you, there we go. Catherine, let's give Catherine a round of applause. Table 8 will focus on AI policy. Catherine is a managing director in Accenture's innovation consulting practice, where she has worked with high-tech clients for the past 13 years. She is also an executive fellow at the World Economic Forum and leads Accenture's collaborative with the Forum on their AI Governance Alliance, including a project about AI governance and another about AI transformation of industry. She is a graduate of GSPP class, MPA class of 2022. Table 9, where's table 9? Awesome. Table 9 is on health policy, and it is being facilitated by Ruth Liu, who is Jennifer's mom, by the way. Yes, mother-daughter dynamic duo here. Let's give Ruth a round of applause, please. Ruth Liu is a MPP 1999 alumni who has held executive level health policy positions at several health plans, including Kaiser and Blue Shield, and served as Associate Secretary for Health and Health Policy at the California Health and Human Services Agency under former Governor Schwarzenegger administration. She is happy to talk about health reform, the ACA, and Cover California. Please join Ruth to talk about health policy. And those are our tables, please. We have until 2:30-ish to engage, get to know one another, and discuss an exciting policy topic. Thank you.